welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are attempting something truly monumental. We're trying to analyze the high-level architecture of, well, of human civilization's thought.
It's a big topic. We're talking about these three great streams: philosophy, science, and literature. Our source material calls this whole structure the Triad of Human Genius.
And we're zeroing in on a pretty massive claim from a key document we've been looking at, the Triad of Human Genius, which was written by Lev Nemotin.
Right. And the mission really is to see if we can justify adding a major contemporary thinker, Yuval Noah Harari, to this elite list as a modern, what the source calls a cross-cohort genius.
That inclusion is huge. I mean, it places him in the same conceptual space as figures like Aristotle, who basically invented logic,
Or Einstein.
or Einstein, who redefined physics. It's a really bold claim, and the paper argues this isn't just, a compliment. It's a necessary structural shift in how we even define genius in the 21st century.
Exactly. We can't really judge a modern mind by 4th century BCE standards, can you? So we have to start by defining what the source even means by a cross-cohort genius.
Yeah.
They aren't just brilliant specialists. They're these rare people who can bridge 2, maybe 3 of these domains. They act as integrators. The paper calls them civilization's phase changers.
So like someone who can see the whole board and then basically write the manual for what's coming next.
That's a good way to put it. They take the output of one stream, let's say a scientific discovery, and they convert it into the input for another, like a whole new ethical framework.
They shift the gears of how society understands itself.
That's the critical function. The argument from Nemotin is that for society to move forward, these 3 areas, reflection, empirical study, and expression, they have to stay coherent. The cross-cohort genius is the person who makes that happen.
Okay, let's jump right in then. If the rules for genius are changing, what does this new intellectual landscape of the global era, which the source says starts around 1950, what does that actually look like?
Well, the core observation is it's a real paradox. We live in an age where knowledge is growing exponentially. I mean, more data, more scientists, more computers than ever.
Right.
Yet the source points out that the rate of world-changing originality, what it calls genius density, is actually contracting.
Contracting. Hang on. That seems to go against everything we assume about progress.
Right.
We have more access to knowledge on our phones than the entire Library of Alexandria. How can the number of epoch-making figures be going down?
The data in the study is pretty stark. If you look at the classical age, you had about 2.4 of these major figures for every 100 million people.
Okay.
But if you jump to our era, from 2000 to the present, that number drops to just 0.4.
But couldn't that just be, couldn't we argue that genius hasn't declined? It's just been driven into these super specialized silos.
Yeah.
A top cosmologist is changing the world, but maybe only 5,000 people can even understand their work.
That is exactly the point the source is making. And it's why the whole definition has to change. It's not a drop in raw intelligence. It's a change in our functional need as a civilization.
I see.
So creativity has diffused. It's gone from that singular, brilliant lightning strike of, say, a Newton to this steady light of millions of specialized researchers all working in parallel.
So the greatest contribution in the 21st century isn't necessarily a new discovery, but the ability to gather up all that fragmented knowledge, all that steady light, and fuse it back into one coherent story that makes sense.
Precisely. We're drowning in data. What we need is a lifeguard who can restore narrative coherence, restore meaning.
And this is where Yuval Noah Harari comes in. The source basically says he's the embodiment of this transformation. He fills the functional role of the triadic integrator, because our whole system now depends on synthesizers.
Which is why his inclusion on the list is described as methodological, not ceremonial. He's just the perfect case study for how this whole triad system works when knowledge is global and decentralized.
So let's really test him against the rules. The briefing lays out 5 specific criteria to be a cross-cohort genius. Does Harari actually qualify?
According to this analysis, yes, and pretty indisputably. So first, he bridges 2 or more domains. That's a clear check.
Right.
Second, he converts one mode of thought into another, taking scientific consensus and translating it directly into ethical questions. Third, he's an integrator, not a specialist. Fourth, he shifts broad cultural understanding, not just some niche scholarly debate.
And the 5th?
And fifth, his influence is just massive. It operates at a global scale. I mean, his work is translated into more than 65 languages.
That global reach feels key. The global era needs global resonance.
Okay.
But let's get specific on the domains. Harari's a historian, right? So how does the source justify his role across philosophy, science, and literature?
It maps him out very clearly. So for philosophy, he's tackling these huge foundational questions. free will, consciousness, the ethics of AI. The source argues his work is more than just popularization. It's an applied ethical framework for technological civilization.
Which you could argue is the most urgent philosophical task there is right now. We need the ethical maps for tech that's already here.
Absolutely. Now, for science, and this is where it gets nuanced, he is explicitly not an experimental scientist. He's not in a lab.
Okay, so what is he?
He's a systems-level scientific integrator. He synthesizes findings from dozens of different fields: evolutionary biology, cognitive science, genomics, AI ethics, neuroscience.
So his genius isn't in one specific discovery, but in seeing how all the discoveries connect. He's drawing the lines between the dots that the specialists might be too busy to see.
That's a perfect way to describe it. He reveals the connective tissue, and then, this is the critical part, he translates it all through literature. His books, Sapiens, Homo Deus, they function as global literature. They shape our collective imagination.
This leads us right to the core justification, which is all about function, not form. The argument is that Harari performs this very specific triadic fusion that our civilization needs to grow.
And the source boils that fusion down to a clear feedback loop. He takes scientific data, integrates it into philosophical frameworks, translates those into accessible cultural narratives, and those narratives ignite public ethical debates.
Without that loop, the science just stays in the lab.
Exactly. The philosophy stays in the university, and the public is left completely in the dark.
And this is why the comparison to the historical giants feels justified. He's playing the same role as those earlier polymaths, just in a completely new environment. So let's run through those parallels.
Sure. So take Aristotle. Harari is like Aristotle in that he systematizes a worldview for his time, but where Aristotle had to turn messy speculation into organized inquiry.
Building the system from scratch.
Right. Harari's task is kind of the reverse. He has to take this overwhelming amount of organized data and turn it into a coherent, navigable story. Same function systematization, but a different problem.
That's fascinating. What about the comparison to Goethe?
Like Goethe, he uses narrative to explore scientific ideas. Now, Goethe was a true poet-scientist doing both. Harari's role is a bit different. He uses literature to make sure the scientific paradigms of our time become part of the human story, not just, academic footnotes.
And finally, Einstein.
With Einstein, he translated the mathematical rigor of his work into a moral voice. He connected the atomic age to human responsibility.
Right.
Harari does the same, but with genomics, AI, and infotech. He's taken on that role of translating the immense power of modern science into the urgent moral questions we all have to face.
So, in a nutshell, he's the global synthesizer. He's what's needed to restore coherence in an age of information overload. He's the resonance catalyst for the 21st century triad.
That phrase, resonance catalyst, really gets to the heart of it. The justification isn't about the originality of one discovery. It's about his ability to keep the conversation going between philosophy, science, and literature. He meets the criteria: integration, breadth, depth, impact, and civilizational role.
He shows us how the modern triad has to function. Science gives us the data, philosophy gives us the frameworks to understand it, and literature gives it human meaning so we can actually act on it.
The source makes a compelling case that this law of intellectual resonance is still the key. Our creative vitality depends on keeping those three streams coherent.
So what this study really shows is a fundamental shift in where intellectual energy is focused. In the past, it pooled into a few, incredibly high-temperature minds, and Aristotle, and Einstein.
And today, that energy is diffused across millions. The torch once carried by a single giant is now carried by a crowd.
And that diffusion makes the role of the integrator, the synthesizer, more critical than it has ever been. We need someone who can look up from all the individual flames and see the outline of the whole civilization.
Which brings us to a final, pretty important question for you, the listener, and it comes right out of the source's conclusion about our modern era.
If Harari is the individual integrator for the digital age, the one restoring coherence right now, what comes next? What systems or collective minds represent the next evolution of the cross-cohort genius?
If that intellectual energy is fundamentally diffused now, maybe we should be looking for a collective system, or even a computational one, that can do this integration work next. The challenge will be exactly the same, though.
How do we preserve meaningful resonance
when the volume of informational noise just keeps getting louder?
Food for thought. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of human thought. It's worth considering how those three streams, reflection, empirical study, and expression, come together to shape understanding in your own life.